Story 1. Itch You Can't Scratch. By 2 Away.
It all started after we got back from a family trip around Eastern Europe. We have family in some of the countries, but my mother and father really love the history and architecture of the region. Everything went normally during the trip. We ate good food, saw cool sights, and spent time with distant relatives. I acted like I wanted to go home the whole time, but truth be told, I had fun. My younger sister turned 14 on the trip. We had a big party for her. She was really into makeup and stuff, so my parents got her a bunch of foreign brands that are popular, I guess. As far as I know, it only started once we got back home. My sister started complaining about an itch. She said there was a weird, tickling sensation constantly on her back. She'd always ask anyone, and I mean anyone, even strangers, around to scratch it for her, but was never satisfied. It was as though we just couldn't get the right spot. It seemed very frustrating for her. My mother thought it may be a rash, or an adverse reaction to some of the products she got for her birthday. She saw the doctor, who said there was no sign of any problem with the skin, aside from irritation where she'd obviously been trying to scratch it herself with various objects. She went to see specialists. First a dermatologist, then an immunologist, even naturopaths. My sister, and the rest of us at that point, were getting desperate. About 2 months after we'd returned, it went from an itch to an obsession. She was always scratching, all over her body. She said she could feel the tickle underneath the skin, as if thousands of tiny bugs were crawling around her insides. As she would put it, the closest thing we got to an answer was from a neurologist. He said that there could be problems with her nerves backfiring like crazy. He told us that there were certain medications she could be put on, but they'd have serious and adverse effects. My parents were understandably hesitant, but she was in agony. We all agreed as a family we had no other option. I watched her, getting worse with every day. The medication barely helped, and it left her in a severe mental fog. She had a hard time communicating and paying attention. The only thing she could do properly was scratch her skin. As her brother, watching her go through this was heartbreaking. I was helpless. I was supposed to look out for her, to defend her and take care of her. I was at my wits' end trying to think of what the hell I could do. But if even the doctors have no idea, how the hell could I know? She stopped taking the medication. She said it was giving her uncomfortable side effects. She could hear the itching. She said it was better to deal with the irritating sensation, rather than the disquieting hallucinations. We all understood. We wanted it to be as much her choice as possible, with how to handle things. It was winter at this point. She'd been going for counseling and therapy. My father believed that this was some kind of psychological thing, that a psychologist would be able to help her deconstruct the root of the issue. It's a good thing too, because if the psychologist hadn't noticed, I don't know if any of us would have. She'd been wearing heavy clothing all the time. We assumed it was due to the cold. As it turned out, her body was covered in lacerations. She'd been slowly trying to skin herself. She explained to my parents when the psychologist told them, "You don't understand. Whatever it is, it's inside of me. I have to let it out." My parents were mortified. I was too, but I couldn't help but wonder how she was able to hide it from us so well. I shared a bathroom with her, and I never found traces of blood that couldn't be easily explained away. In the hospital, she was manic, screaming and flailing, refusing to hold still, to let the nurse bandage her. "That's just going to keep it in," she howled, desperately trying to rip through her clothing, to tear at her flesh. It was more than my parents could handle. She was sent to an institution where they could keep an eye on her around the clock. She'd have no access to tools with which to harm herself, and she was forced to wear clothing that inhibited her from scratching. That was a week ago. Today we heard from the hospital. She's dead. The doctors said they weren't sure exactly how it happened, but at some point when she and some other patients were taken for a walk, she'd managed to impale herself on a fence post, through the throat. My mother hasn't spoken a word since we heard the news. My father is furious. He demands to know how this could happen, when it's supposed to be a secure facility. Me? I'm torn. As I sit here writing this, I'm devastated from the loss of my dear sister, but I'm distracted. I'm terrified, and I have no idea what to do now. I haven't told anyone, especially not my family, but something has happened. A few days ago, I felt an itch. An itch I just can't scratch?
Story 2. Back from Hell by Unknown.
Too long have I been terrified and paranoid of things I do not understand. Hell has a means of being horrific. I know that better than any man alive, and I have for a year. Recently, though, hell has returned. It is back. I was checking my computer to start the day when I noticed I had a message. I've lived as a shut-in for a long time. I moved out of my old neighborhood and I don't take any packages. I only ever leave the house to go shopping. I don't know anybody that would message me to talk. But with this case in particular, I felt a temptation to open and read it, one that I could not overcome. My fear was quickly provoked. All my paranoia, my borderline schizophrenic behavior, it was all there to expect this one message. I couldn't resist it though. I had to see it. Dear Jacques, it has been a long time since our last encounter. Despite your best efforts, you have still spread my works. You still instill fear in those around you, and as you only now realize, fear is my truest power. I wanted to scroll down. I needed to see it, but my computer turned off. Out of the CD port came a dollar bill missing the insignias. I looked closer at it, though, and I saw my own face. My computer turned itself back on. My default background had changed to a picture of my old house. Most of my files were gone, but the letter was still there and opened itself. Need more? I can do a lot more. You have done a lot of my work for me. I'm coming over to give you a reward. Besides that, you should have something to eat. Take this and eat of it. One of the dressers in my computer desk opened, and in it was a bowl of soup with a spoon in it. I had to taste it. I didn't want to try it. I tried to walk away, but I couldn't. I lost control of my body. My legs walked to the soup. My hands reached down and lifted the spoon to my mouth. My mouth opened and my throat swallowed. It tasted spectacular, however. I regained control of myself, and now I went to eat it by my own will. It was the best food I had ever eaten, and soon it was gone. I continued reading the letter. I'm glad you enjoyed it. It took many people to make it taste that well. I am soon to be there to greet you. See you soon, Jacques. From Hell. My hands shook. Cold sweat covered me. The light bulb in the room began to crack, water dripping through. The door was gone, and the windows with it. The room began to get dark. The computer shut down, and it became completely black. I heard a couple of footsteps around me, and I wanted to scream, but I couldn't. Then, the room was lit up again, now with a crimson-cloaked figure in front of me. Candles surrounded him and covered the room around us. People always misunderstand me. The cloaked figure turned to me. His face was wrinkled and old, his skin lacking complexion. His eyes were misshapen, and one side of his face hung lower than the other. His mouth barely moved as he spoke. They don't understand why I do the things I do. People don't understand that I hardly do anything at all. Every genocide, every famine, every article about bombings or drownings. I did none of that. That is not my work. You all have made war for me. You have destabilized the globe and turned a blind eye to misery and suffering. The candles around him began to levitate and spin around him as he spoke. With every word he said, he made more and more sense to me. I began to listen less out of fear of consequence and more to listen. He stuck out one of his hands, similar to his face and lack of complexion and wrinkles, and he pointed at me. The candles began to go out. Now he bows in front of me, swearing he will live by my code, swearing he will join me in hell. You all will come to fear him, and you all will come to fear me. I say you all for a reason. One may question the legitimacy of his claims, so I tell you this. I say this because I know he will share this story. He has no choice.
Story 3. Bad Behavior by Cornconic.
When I was young, I had a somewhat peculiar hobby. It wasn't anything disturbing or gross, just unorthodox. In the mornings, when the sun shone brightly through the windows of my house, I would prance about the rooms, jumping and twirling like a ballet dancer. I'm not entirely sure why. It was simply a little ritual I performed. Even then, it felt odd, but it was calming and mindful, almost like a type of meditation. Usually, I'd have a tune in my head that I'd quietly hum along to, pretending I was enacting some sort of big performance for all my adoring fans. It sounds silly, I know, but I was only a child. Kids do weird stuff all the time, right? One day, I was enjoying another dancing session, practicing my acrobatic moves through the kitchen. On my final cartwheel, I heard a mighty smash, just as I planted my feet back onto the floorboards. I recoiled in shock. I knew what had happened even before I cast my eyes upon the kitchen floor. Shattered ceramic pieces lay scattered around my feet. I had knocked down a plate from the counter. Panic rushed through my body. There was no doubt that Mother would have heard. It was a small house and she was only in the next room over. I stood paralyzed, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. Mother had never cared for my special hobby, and now she had a perfectly good reason to scold me for it. She might not ever let me do it again. As I feared, Mother appeared at the doorway, scowling. She shook her head at the shattered plate, getting visibly angry as the seconds passed by. Already, my face was red and tearful. I choked, trying to force out an apology, but before I could say a word, she grabbed me by the ear and pulled me to the staircase. I wailed pleadingly, but to no avail. Mother would scarcely change her mind once she had decided on something. She dragged me all the way up the stairs until we arrived at a small closet-like room, no wider than a bathtub. With a bitter shove, she pushed me inside, slamming the door behind me. I turned, only to have the door lock as soon as my arms reached to push it open again. I begged Mother to let me out, banging my fists against the door. Tears still streamed down my face, dripping off my chin. Every time you misbehave, I want you to remember, you could have been one of them. Mother shouted over me, her voice loud and fierce. I knew she meant the jars. As Mother's footsteps faded across the corridor, I slid down the wall in anguish, sobbing softly to myself. The room was dark and dingy, and I could practically hear the spiders crawling across the walls, most likely inches from my head. The only light was from a small window that was too high for me to reach. But that didn't matter. What made me loathe that room so much was the jars. They lay upon an old shelf opposite to where I sat, half a dozen of them, all lined up neatly in a row. Each was about the size of your fist. A viscous fluid oozed inside of the jars. It was thick and transparent, allowing me to see the monstrosities that hid within, just barely visible. Pinkish creatures, like little gummy people, were stashed away in the jars. 6 of them, their arms and legs stretched out in front of their bodies, which were misshapen and curved, floating gently within the fluid. It pained me just to look at them, as if the frail beings inside were watching me with their tiny eyes. So, there I lay, drifting in and out of slumber. What little sleep I got was plagued with horrible nightmares. I dreamt of the creatures. Let loose from their jars, they surrounded me, crawling upon my skin like large cockroaches. I tried in vain to swat them away, but there were dozens, hundreds, and I found myself overwhelmed, slowly suffocating on the cold, hard floor, covered in little gummy people. It was the next day before I awoke to the sound of Mother undoing the heavy bolt on the closet door. It squeaked loudly as it opened, and Mother's face soon came into view, glaring at me with a cold-blooded stare. "No more bad behavior," she told me, and I nodded wearily, tears still stained on my cheeks.
Thanks for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe to listen to similar stories in future.